Melissa, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So, our subject today is equality and dignity. Obviously, this series of podcasts is about DEI and theological perspectives on it, and we're giving attention to the core concepts associated with DEI. The E stands for equity. Equity is very similar to equality. And at a recent working group, Melissa, you gave a presentation on equality and dignity. We had told you we were interested in Alasdair MacIntyre's talk at Notre Dame about
Mhm.
dignity and his claim, as I recall, that human beings do not have inherent dignity. They just have the inherent capacity for dignity.
Mhm.
And I remember RJ Snell, our colleague, said during those discussions that he takes that argument seriously, but not literally. I remembered when I watched the video of MacIntyre giving that talk at Notre Dame, one of the first questioners in the audience was Melissa Moschella. Um, and so I think it was after I saw that I may have asked you, would you like to come to the working group and provide some of your own thoughts on equality and dignity and perhaps engage with MacIntyre's argument? So maybe the way we could begin is for you to just lay out some of your thoughts on equality and dignity and maybe how your view of those terms, definition of those terms relates to DEI. So,
Great. Well, yeah, I mean, I think, as you said, I think it's an important and kind of vexed concept, the concept of dignity in connection to the concepts of equality and equity. And I think the MacIntyre lecture, in a sense, exemplifies some of the complexity of the concept. And it seems to me that MacIntyre was leaning into what you might consider to be one reasonable way of talking about dignity. But I think that there are other reasonable ways of talking about dignity as well, right? So, as you mentioned, MacIntyre argued provocatively, as is his wont, right, that our dignity is something that we have to earn through virtuous actions that promote the common good. And so it's unclear whether, if push came to shove, he would disagree with anything that I'm going to say here. It's possible that he's just emphasizing a particular angle on the question, right? So what I think is that if you look at the Catholic theological and philosophical tradition, you can kind of do a both and to the supposed dichotomy between thinking about dignity as something that's earned versus thinking about dignity as something that's intrinsic and equal among all human beings. Um, and you can do that by recognizing that the concept has different meanings that are analogically related to each other, right? So I would say that the core meaning of dignity in some respects, maybe not the meaning that MacIntyre was referring to based on Aquinas, but I think a core meaning of dignity in the tradition is dignity meant as what philosophers call kind of basic moral status, or the thing that makes you a subject of rights, that makes you the kind of being who needs to be considered when you think about claims of justice, the kind of being to whom something can be owed in justice. I like to illustrate this with my students when I say, if I'm working at my desk and a fly comes buzzing around, bothering me, right, I have not the slightest qualms, swatting at the fly, even trying to kill the fly, right? I tend to consider myself a morally sensitive person, but I don't think there's anything morally suspect about that treatment of the fly, because I just don't see the fly as a subject of rights, as a being with moral status, as a being that anything can be owed to in justice, right? Whereas, if my colleague walks into my office and is interrupting me at a bad time and starts to be kind of annoyingly chatty when I'm very busy or something like that, I can't deal with my colleague in the same way, right? I need to, politely say, oh, I'd love to talk to you another time, but I'm really busy right now. Perhaps we could have coffee, right? Right? I can't just swat away the colleague. Certainly not try to kill the colleague, right? The way that I would treat the fly. I mean, this is obvious, right? But the point is, that's what we're getting at, I think, with this fundamental idea of dignity as moral status. That there are certain sorts of beings that are the subject of rights that deserve a certain level, kind of minimal level of treatment and concern and respect because they have this dignity, because they have this moral status. And I think that this equal fundamental dignity or moral status is something that's based on the kind of beings that we are, namely beings that possess a rational nature, a nature that is the basis for our capacities of intellect and freedom that make it possible for us to know and love God and others, to make free choices, to be morally responsible, and so on. And if you look at the Catholic tradition, this is often how the biblical claim that human beings are created in the image and likeness of God, which is the ground of our dignity, that I think philosophically lines up nicely with, or can be interpreted as, recognizing this capacity that we have for freedom, for love, for knowledge, that goes beyond just merely at the sense level. And since these capacities are spiritual capacities, they're capacities that are rooted in our very being. They're not limited to any particular physical organ. These are capacities that I think, even philosophically, we can reasonably defend as capacities that every single member of the human species possesses, even if, due to immaturity or disability or illness, some particular person or a person at a particular stage of life doesn't exhibit these capacities for freedom or higher level thinking. So that's kind of the first level of dignity that's equal and fundamental for all. So that's when we're talking about human beings having intrinsic dignity or being equal in this sense, we're talking about this equal moral status. But then when we're talking about human beings as having different levels of dignity, which is also another reasonable way of talking about it, well, there we get, I think, to what you might think about as the level at which we kind of live up to our dignity or actualize our dignity through good use of these rational capacities that we have, through good use of our freedom, which the tradition views as ordered to particular ends, ordered to the good, ordered to love of God and love of neighbor. And of course, sadly, we often fail to use our freedom in line with these purposes, and instead we act in ways sometimes that fail to respect our own good or others' good. And so when that happens, we fail to live up to our dignity. We fail to really actualize and manifest our dignity. And so at that level, there's the sense in which those who are, for instance, more morally exemplary, those who make greater contributions to the common good through their lives, that such people can be said to have a higher level of dignity in this second sense. But arguably, no matter how badly a person acts, no matter how low somebody falls on this scale of kind of moral dignity or actualized dignity, still, I think all human beings retain a fundamental basic dignity that nothing can alter, and that's the ground for a requirement that we treat all human beings with a certain minimal level of respect. So this fundamental level of dignity is what establishes a kind of baseline of basic rights that requires that we respect all people's good in its various fundamental dimensions, including, for instance, the good of life itself, without which no other goods can be pursued. And so, to put that into the language of rights, you might say, well, if we have to respect people's, fundamental good, including the fundamental good of their life itself, that means that everybody has an inviolable, inalienable right not to be murdered, right? And everybody else has an absolute moral obligation, an obligation of justice to refrain from murdering another human being, right? And you could say similar things about other basic rights, like rights not to be raped or tortured or mutilated or things like that, right? Now, these are all negative rights, right? Rights that correspond to absolute moral prohibitions or to obligations of justice to refrain from doing something that violates another's good in some fundamental respect. But there are also positive rights, obligations of justice that go beyond simply refraining from inflicting harm on people, right? So you could think about, rights to education or rights to healthcare, but determining how to specify those rights gets much more complicated by contrast with those kind of negative rights that I was just talking about, right? Rights not to be murdered, not to be tortured, not to be raped, not to be mutilated, and so on. And it's more complicated when you talk about positive rights because, on the one hand, you can only have a genuine right to something that is objectively good, but many of the rights claims in our culture are claims for things that, at least from the perspective of Catholic theology and the natural law philosophical tradition, are contrary to human fulfillment, right? The claim, for instance, that there's a right to access pornography or a right to abortion, those would be pseudo rights according to the Catholic tradition, because the things that people are asking for are actually contrary to their well-being. But even when a rights claim corresponds to a genuine good, like, again, the right to education or employment or adequate housing or healthcare, there are still complicated questions of distributive justice involved in determining how to allocate those benefits. So to what extent do we have a claim to those sorts of goods simply because of our fundamental dignity as human beings? To what extent does our claim depend on our merit insofar as it relates to the good in question? When it comes to goods like education, food, or housing, for instance, some people might argue that a just society would try to ensure that everybody has access to a kind of basic minimum, but then that beyond that minimum, perhaps allocation should track merit in some sense. But obviously, that's not an uncontroversial way of thinking about that. But that's a plausible way of thinking about it. So this is also further complicated by the fact that, as DEI advocates will always remind us, the playing field is often very far from level, given that many people start off with considerable advantages or disadvantages due to factors completely outside of their control. And then a last complication regarding positive rights is that we also have to determine who has the duty to provide the good or benefit in question. The duty might fall on different people or groups to different degrees. So, for instance, adults of sound mind and body are usually considered to be the ones with the primary obligation to obtain goods like food, housing, and so on for themselves and for their dependents. Or the duty to educate and care for children belongs primarily to those children's parents. But then what happens when parents lack the resources to fulfill this duty entirely themselves? Or what happens when parents are irresponsible, right? So then to what extent does the larger community have an obligation to step in and provide assistance? And then what form should such assistance take? And does it matter in those cases whether or not parents' failure to be able to provide for their children or themselves is due to their own irresponsible choices? There are also questions about the extent to which the larger community has a duty to try to level the playing field for children, given that some will obviously be born into situations that give them greater opportunities than others. And another question is, to what extent should our response to the needs of adults depend on the degree to which they suffered certain disadvantages as children? And so these are all extremely complicated questions, to to which I don't think there's any single right answer, right? I think people of goodwill can have disagreements about the right answers to those questions. But I do think that this distinction between fundamental dignity that is intrinsic and equal for all on the one hand versus actualized dignity, which depends on merit, um, gives some insight into how to approach these complicated questions. So, the recognition that all human beings have fundamental dignity sets a baseline of basic rights that must always be respected. But then when puzzling through more complex questions about positive rights, I think it's also crucial to keep in mind that helping people flourish is largely a matter of helping them to actualize their dignity. And when we understand that this actualization of dignity comes through our own free choices and actions, this helps to recognize that any attempts to promote equity will be, in fact, counterproductive to the extent that they directly or indirectly undermine people's capacity to exercise their own agency in morally responsible ways. So I think that some of the well-intentioned efforts to emphasize, systemic barriers to advancement that certain people face can actually undermine people's ability to actualize their dignity by giving them the sense that they are powerless, by taking away their sense of agency rather than by empowering them with messages that indicate that they do have the capacity to improve their situation through their own choices and responsible actions, even if it's recognized that they're starting at a certain level of disadvantage. So I'll stop there, but then, obviously happy to kind of talk more about any of these points.
There are many things I could ask. I think maybe the most important question I have is, it seems to me that the notion that human beings have inherent fundamental dignity is obviously crucial, not just to your presentation, but to the worldview of many people in Western societies, Christian or not. So you think that that is true? You think that
Yes.
you know that is true?
Yes.
And I'm curious, is that knowable through reason alone, do you think? Or do you need revelation to know that? How exactly is it that theology helps one know that? Or is it not necessary? Do you not need theology in order to know that? Just going a little further, I mean, obviously, dignity is an abstract concept. There's no physical evidence of dignity. You can imagine a very sophisticated, very rational, agnostic or atheist, non-Christian, just saying, I don't see this dignity you speak of. It just strikes me as an axiom, that if believed will lead to a certain kind of society, and if not believed will lead to another kind of society. And so maybe you could argue that believing in inherent fundamental dignity produces better consequences and is good from a consequentialist point of view. But is there actually something about reality that you are seeing that like the Romans didn't see? Just and I could see this person also saying, how are we equal to each other? The only kind of non-controversial sense in which we're equal to each other is that we're all equally human beings, right? I don't think it's true to say that we're equally rational or equally free or even equally capable of rationality and freedom. I mean, there probably are genetic differences between people that lead to differences in their capacity to be rational and to exercise rational control over themselves, which I think is a reasonable definition of freedom. So anyway, I'm just going to throw that all back at you.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a great set of questions. And I mean, I do think that in principle, one can give a cogent philosophical argument, not grounded in any theological claims, not grounded in any claims of revelation, to defend what I've just said, right? To defend the idea that all human beings possess a rational nature, right? And so the nature idea here is key, right? It's a root capacity for conceptual thought and free choices. And so it's the possession of that nature that is the basis for our ability to then exercise rational thought and free choices, that gives us equal fundamental dignity. And then obviously, as you said, the extent to which we actualize or manifest that nature varies greatly from person to person. Right. So when you're looking just at the level of what people can actually do in the here and now, clearly what is obvious is difference, right? Difference in degrees of intelligence, difference in levels of moral responsibility, differences in, the extent to which people have a kind of self-mastery and their ability to direct their actions toward their goals, and so on. So those differences are quite obvious. And that's what, has led many people to deny that there is any such thing as a kind of fundamental human equality. And, and it's true that prior to Christianity, I don't think that there was any widespread belief, and that there doesn't seem to be any evidence in terms of, ancient civilizations or pre-Christian philosophers of a belief in something like intrinsic equal dignity for all human beings. What seemed obvious to these people was inequality, not equality. And so I think historically, the development and then kind of widespread acceptance of the idea that all human beings have a certain fundamental equality, deserve a certain fundamental level of respect. I do think that that came from Christianity. So, and there are many secular philosophers who have recognized this. People like Jürgen Habermas, for instance, very famously said that he doesn't think that the basic ideals of Western democracy, right, things like respect for the freedom and equality of human beings and so on, that he really doesn't think that those would have developed and been so widely accepted if it had not been for Christianity, right? And so there's a way in which, to the extent that these societies have now become secularized, there's a way in which it's a kind of table whose legs have been cut out from under it, right? That we still want to, or at least we want to pay lip service to these ideals of basic freedom and equality of all human beings. But the underpinnings in terms of a kind of deeply Christian culture that led to the widespread acceptance of those views have largely been undercut. And so, yes, while I do think theoretically it's possible to give a good argument for it without the theology, I doubt that societally and kind of civilizationally that you can support widespread adherence to this view, because the philosophical arguments are just quite difficult.
Yeah, and reason just doesn't matter that much.
What do you mean by reason not mattering that much?
This is my own personal axe to grind lately. I'm just struck when I observe society that reason seems to matter not a whit.
Oh, yes.
Reason is just used. It's used in the service of all kinds of desires, but for me, it's extremely rare to encounter someone where I really feel like they're just interested in the truth. They're just curious and they're kind of willing to go where the reasons lead. So my working model of society is that reason is a very impotent, fragile force. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm really trying to agree with you that, but because I think what you're saying is you can reason your way toward a belief in fundamental dignity, but in order to achieve that at scale in society, you're going to need something more than philosophical argumentation. You're going to need Christianity or something,
Right, exactly.
like that. Yeah.
I'm reminded of there's I forget exactly where, but John Henry Newman has one of his kind of witticisms, quarry the granite with a razor or try to tether a great ship by a thread of silk, and then you might stand a chance of taming the pride and passion of human beings with reason alone. I've always remembered that, and I've remembered it as someone who still, I think my habitual disposition is to approach things in a way that's broadly Aristotelian and Thomistic. Um, yeah, I suppose by way of summation before we pivot, Melissa, do you think that, just as you said earlier, that Christianity is what helped reason to discover these things, which you hold in principle reason can show? Do you think it's also true that faith, or Christianity in particular, is necessary to maintain these truths as a moral vision which can be effective in society and be a part of a common stock of cultural and social touchstones? Do you think that that's fair?
Yes, I do think that that's true. I think we're kind of living on the residue of a Christian culture, and I think unless there's a kind of revitalization of that, it seems to me that our commitments to these ideals of freedom and equality will erode. I mean, I think there's a way in which we can see that they already have in certain respects, right? That in certain respects they seem to be at the heart of the, say the DEI commitment, for instance. But in other ways, at least some of the ideology that tends to go along with DEI is actually not recognizing fundamental equality, right? It's putting people into it's just changing the hierarchy, right? But it's now a kind of different identity hierarchy where equality is no longer fully recognized, even though it's kind of in the name of equality. So there are obviously internal tensions, but there are also some human beings that seem to get left out of concern as well. The unborn, for instance, or in some cases, people with certain types of disabilities, maybe, or people at the end of life. Many who are very committed to the DEI cause would have no problem with saying that perhaps the life of somebody with advanced Alzheimer's lacks real value, right? Or the life of an unborn child, or even an infant, in some cases, lacks real value.
Yeah, and I certainly I don't really sense, at least in the more radical sectors of cultural progressivism, any great generosity of spirit toward all human beings qua humans. And what I mean by that is I see a lot of tribalism where white people or men or whatever are basically the out group, generally viewed negatively. It is okay to speak ill of them in crude terms that would not be acceptable toward others. In other words, there's a willingness to subject a certain segment of society to indignity.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, we certainly see it in the campus protests that are going on right now, right, where it seems perfectly acceptable to call for the destruction of the Jews, right? But there's great sympathy, which I can recognize as a good thing, right, for the plight of the people of Gaza. But it's completely one-sided, right? There's sympathy only for one of these two groups rather than for both, and that's because of the kind of identitarian politics that does effectively deny equality in some levels, even though it's based on, I mean, yes, there are many tensions in it, right? Even this kind of exaltation of the victim, it's really a Christian trope. And so, so it's kind of ironic, right, that this is also a kind of residue of Christian culture that has, in some respects, been distorted in some of these current identitarian ideologies.
I also think that especially white Westerners, without their guilt, without their propensity for guilt, this whole political phenomenon would be inconceivable. And there's sort of a coalition between, you could say, guilty white Westerners, or at least guilt signaling white Westerners on the one hand, and then some groups or some people that are actually just pursuing their own power and status advantages, and there's a kind of coalition between them. But I guess my
Yeah.
point there is that that propensity for guilt too, I think, comes out of Christianity.
Yes.
Before you go on, Marcus, I just wanted to ask Melissa, have you heard about this book, Pagan America by John Daniel Davidson?
No, I don't think I have.
Okay, yeah, I've been seeing references to it recently, and I think the argument there is that we're already pagan, we're already post-Christian,
I see.
and that's Imago Dei is gone basically outside of certain pockets, and it's simply a matter of time before we become a dignity denying slave society, although they won't,
Hmm.
the slaves will not be called slaves. These are just the fragments I've picked up based on commentary, but it seems pretty relevant to what we're talking about. Marcus, let me turn it over to you.
Of course, yeah. I did want to go back to your answer to my earlier question, Melissa, about what reason can in principle accomplish on its own and the role of faith as well. Because if it's true that reason can accomplish certain things, can discover certain truths about human dignity, maybe also about the nature and existence of God, for instance, on its own in principle, but in practice, if reason does really need faith to be itself, as it were, as I think you were saying earlier, what implications do you think this has here and now for Catholic thinkers, Catholic philosophers, people who want to intervene, coming out of this religious perspective, um, and persuasively speak to non-religious people about these questions? How can, at the same time, how can we draw on the resources that don't involve religious claims, while at the same time being maybe open about the relationship that we do think exists between faith and reason?
Yeah, I think that's a question. It's a tricky question, one that I've grappled with, as a professor of philosophy, and something that I often think about, how to approach in the classroom. And I have typically tried to use purely philosophical arguments in the classroom, or at least make it clear if I'm ever relying on an argument that is not philosophical, but and that would be much more of an exception. But I will bring up the ways in which the philosophical arguments dovetail with the arguments of the Christian tradition. Now, perhaps some people might find that simply diving into the theological arguments themselves would be worthwhile, but I do think there is value in helping people to see that you can give a reason-based account of these beliefs, because I think even this is I think valuable, perhaps above all, though not only, for believers themselves, because in the face of a culture which in some ways is hostile to Christian belief right now, I think it's very important for believers to have the confidence that what they believe is in fact reasonable, and to have the confidence that they can explain what they believe without any direct appeal to revelation, to friends, colleagues, family members, coworkers, right, who are not believers. So, and also politically, right, that many people feel, I think in some respects, unreasonably, that they ought not to let their religious views influence how they act in the political sphere. But I think also recognizing that no, these are beliefs that are accessible to all people of goodwill in principle. I think that also gives people confidence to be willing to advocate for them politically, or to advocate for policies based on them in the political sphere. So I mean, I personally think that when it comes to the aspect of giving people the faith that will help to buttress their reason, in a sense, I think that comes most effectively more in the personal sphere, right? In the sphere of friendship, in the sphere of the family, in the classroom, I mean, certainly there's room for very good teaching of theology in the classroom and so on, and that can be helpful, but it's just a different dynamic, right? I mean, just as very few people, not none, but very few people radically change their views due to a philosophy course, I think likewise, very few people, though not none, radically change their views due to a theology course, or at least not in isolation, right? Not in isolation from more personal witness friendships and so on that help to get at the emotional side of us, right? Which is crucial for being willing to open-mindedly kind of reconsider beliefs that you have long held to be true, right? So we need to engage with people on that more emotional side to be able to even open them to listen open-mindedly to the reasons why they might want to consider changing their beliefs.
I guess in this sort of context, when we're thinking about public advocacy for moral conclusions which are consonant with the Christian vision, or which are part of the Christian vision, but also we think there are rational grounds for accessing these ideas too. I think of the contrast sometimes between, say, the natural law approach to, say, defending the lives of the unborn on the one hand, and on the other hand, there's this famous anecdote. I don't recall exactly where I first discovered it, but an occasion where Stanley Hauerwas, the Methodist moral theologian, was addressing Congress, I think it was, on the question of abortion. And there was a point in the proceedings where Hauerwas simply said, Christians don't murder their children, right? I take it that kind of, Melissa, you're thinking that maybe that kind of language, that kind of thicker moral vocabulary, or other examples of it, that has a place, but it would be a mistake to lead with it in addressing a pluralistic public audience, or maybe something would be lost if that was how we began proceeding because of the way in which sort of the moral fabric has eroded today.
I mean, I don't think it would be a mistake to use that kind of language in certain contexts or with certain people, or that's one of the languages that is used to defend these beliefs, right? I think that's important. Right. And for some people, it will resonate. But for others, it won't, right? So I do think we need to use all the different angles and types of language and types of arguments that are at our disposal, both reason-based and revelation-based, and I don't think we should exclude either of those.
Right. Okay. Thank you. I'd like to switch gears and maybe return to where we began in this conversation, Melissa, when you first introduced the distinction between fundamental dignity and acquired dignity, maybe, or let's use that language, fundamental versus acquired. And you alluded, I think, to Alasdair MacIntyre's recent address, where he was focusing more, maybe we could say focusing more on the concept of acquired dignity or acquirable dignity to the expense, or maybe even to the exclusion of the concept of a fundamental dignity. What do you think? First, this is just a basic question, Melissa. What do you think is the reason that has been leading thinkers like MacIntyre and others as well to distance themselves from the concept of fundamental dignity and focus more on this concept of acquired dignity?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think in MacIntyre's case, it seemed to me that there was a particular concern with how some of these emphases on basic dignity and equality ended up kind of ringing hollow, or ended up leading to an overemphasis on things like negative rights, and to a failure to do anything to ensure that people have things like basic necessities or healthcare. Right? So I think he was worried, and this came out in his address, particularly toward the end, that he felt that there might be basically a neglect of the positive claims that people have to receive assistance, and that can relate in some way to this emphasis on a kind of baseline requirement of, treating people with a baseline level of respect that means not harming them, but that doesn't necessarily extend to doing positive things to help them.
I think one example was abortion, because he said, if you're going to talk about the rights of the unborn children, then it's also incumbent on you to allocate your some of your surplus energy, resources, et cetera, to creating conditions that will allow pregnant mothers in difficult situations to care for their children. I think that was one example, if I remember correctly.
Right. Yeah, he made that example, and he was talking about that. In fact, I forget the exact political figure, but I believe it was a political figure in Ireland or something like that,
Yeah.
who was very strongly anti-abortion, but also was opposed to measures that would provide free childcare. I forget what it was, right? Free healthcare, free childcare, other sorts of things that MacIntyre thinks then ought to be provided, so as to reduce the sense that people need to have an abortion because they are not able to care for their children. Now, I think there are ways in which that was an unfair argument on his part. I mean, first of all, because if you look at the pro-life movement, at least in this country, right, which is the one I'm most familiar with, it's clear that even if this might not be happening at the level of politics, in the level of civil society, right, there's just an incredible amount of people who volunteer their time, their money, their talents to help women facing difficult unplanned pregnancies, and to provide them with the support that they need, both during their pregnancy and afterward, as they're taking care of the baby. Crisis pregnancy centers, people willing to adopt, including willingness to adopt children who have disabilities or medical problems. So the pro-life community is doing more than anybody else is actually to help women in difficult pregnancy situations. And the political questions, I think, are much more complicated than MacIntyre's, kind of provocative. Well, isn't this contradictory to be anti-abortion but not to want to have certain kind of laws about childcare or something? Well, it's complicated, right? Because all of these policies create incentives, and it's not always clear whether those incentives are good or bad, right? How they distort things. Do they create an incentive for more out of wedlock births, for instance, which is something that we don't want? So that's just an example, right?
Yeah.
It is, it's not to say that a certain level of policies like that aren't a good idea. I don't know, but I think in order to think about that, you really need to think seriously about the structural incentives that you're creating and whether those are good or bad, and whether they in the end do more harm than good. So it's more complicated than MacIntyre would have us believe, I think.
Yeah, you can't assume in a facile manner that if you care about some need in society, you must support some kind of large government program in order to support. And that, frankly, the left side of the political spectrum has been making that argument for generations, and it seems to work in our society. And yes, I had the same, based on a couple of talks that I've seen from MacIntyre, he often just makes that very facile assumption, it seems to me, and it's kind of frustrating.
Yes.
Yeah. So Melissa, I wanted to ask you one more thing. You said and wrote, it is crucial to keep in mind that helping people to flourish is largely a matter of helping people to actualize their dignity through their own choices and actions, and thus that attempts to promote equity will be counterproductive to the extent that they directly or indirectly undermine people's capacity to exercise their own agency in morally responsible ways. I guess the question I would ask you is, if I can ask your personal view, how do you think that DEI scores in this regard?
I mean, I don't know enough details to kind of give a blanket answer to that. One thing that I have read that has certainly influenced my thinking about this, and that I found very, very helpful in thinking about this, is the excellent book by Ian Rowe, titled Agency. And Roe is very interesting because he's used to be in charge of a large charter school program, and so he has a lot of kind of on the ground experience with what actually helps people who are in disadvantaged situations to be upwardly mobile socially, right, to improve their situation, what actually empowers people, right, in these disadvantaged situations. And he is appalled by a lot of the ways in which DEI has influenced schools, at least. And he gives some, I think, very powerful quotes from people. I have the book in front of me here, so I'm going to quote from one African-American parent in Evanston, Illinois, who basically talked about how, as a result of the introduction of this more kind of DEI approach in the school, that her children now feel disempowered. And this is what the woman said. My children have always been so proud of who they are. Then all of a sudden they started to question themselves because of what they were taught after arriving here. My son has wanted to be a lawyer since he was 11. Then one day he came home and told me, "But mommy, there are these systems put in place that prevent Black people from accomplishing anything." That's what they're teaching Black kids, that all of this time for the past 400 years, this is what white people have done to you and your people. The narrative is you can't get ahead. Right? So again, that's an extremely disempowering message for a child to hear. Now, clearly it's well-intentioned, right? That recognition of the disadvantages that Black people have faced and continue to face. But to the extent that that message simply disempowers people and makes them think that they're doomed to be victims regardless of what they do, that they're doomed to failure regardless of what they do, that really takes away their ability to exercise their agency. He also gives an example of a charter school network, the KIPP charter school network. Knowledge is power, and I forget what the second P stands for, but basically the KIPP charter schools had a famous slogan or motto of "Work hard, be nice," and they were told that if they were willing to put in the work, and that if they were willing to treat other people with respect, that they could get ahead in life, right? And students who were in the KIPP schools, from very disadvantaged backgrounds, really felt empowered by this message, right? They learned that with hard work they could accomplish their goals. That even though they faced disadvantages, they could get ahead if they were willing to work hard. And now in the face of the DEI ideology, they have abandoned that slogan because they worry that it blames the victim, right? That then if people fail to succeed, then they will think it's because they didn't work hard enough, as opposed to recognizing that it's due to systemic injustices or things like that, right? So, but again, in getting rid of that, they now have exchanged a slogan, a motto that was empowering, and that gave kids direction for how they could improve their lot in life, to a slogan that really doesn't actually help their students and ends up disempowering them. Right? So those are just a couple of
it seems
small examples.
I think it's very obvious to everyone, really, or almost everyone. If you have a kid and you want your kid to be well-adjusted, mentally healthy, virtuous, productive, all of those things, then what you want to do is be unconditionally loving, but at the same time hold your child to the highest standards, and not withdraw love if they fail, but encourage them to be the best that they can be, and to some extent penalize them if they're failing to be virtuous or failing to make the most of their potential. And I think DEI, cultural progressivism, in a lot of ways, just is not treating the victim groups in this way. Whether it's giving people positions they're not qualified for, passing over more qualified people and giving it to them because they are non-white or women or whatever it
Hmm.
is, um, holding them to lower standards in terms of test scores and grades, even not prosecuting petty crimes
Hmm.
because of the disparate racial outcomes that might produce. I mean, there's even I think that often a moral free pass is given to people who are
Hmm.
in victim groups, right? Where you can say these terrible words. Only these people can't, like the N word. I mean, it's a little odd
Yeah,
that,
yeah,
like, oh, you guys can say that word, it's fine, but white people can't say it. Or you can be racist toward white people and not pay much of a consequence. In other words, so you're saying to non-white people, oh, you can be racist. It's fine.
right.
Or to women, you can be sexist. It's fine. And so, I mean, you add all of this up and it's like, okay, you can achieve at a lower level. You can commit petty crime and pay no consequence. You can be held less morally responsible. You will not be blamed. You will not be criticized. Your identity protects you. Yeah, it doesn't seem like a recipe for actualizing dignity.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I completely agree. Yeah, I mean, I also think it's very interesting, this new book, Troubled, by it's Rob Henderson, I think it is. I mean, it's also interesting. I mean, it's a different scenario. It's not an issue with identity politics or anything like that. Um, but again, in his kind of life story, what becomes clear is that despite all the disadvantages of having been uh, abandoned by his mother as a baby, and shuffled from foster care home to foster care home, and never really had any kind of stable family, and living in poverty, right, for his entire childhood. That what eventually helped him was being in the military, right? Was that was he then was basically given learned discipline, right, and had to meet certain expectations, and then was rewarded, right, for performing well and meeting those expectations, and that eventually was crucial to his being able to turn his life around, and eventually went to Yale, and as um, that's an extraordinary story, but I think it simply speaks to the need, especially that young people have, to have a sense of clear expectations for their conduct, obviously combined with love, and forgiveness, and so on, right? But some sense of discipline and expectations are actually really important for our thriving. And just being given a free pass is actually not that helpful, because it just tells kids in that situation, it just tells them, well, yeah, we actually don't think you can do any better, so we're not going to bother with you enough to discipline you, right? So it's actually not an empowering message for them to just give them a free pass.
And I'll note that my sense is that a ton of people in our society really think they're doing these people a favor. They really
Right,
believe that.
right.
They
It's well
yeah.
intentioned,
Yeah, it's well
um,
intentioned. Yeah.
but I don't think it's actually helpful.
Maybe part of what's at work in this sphere is too one-sided an emphasis on our moral status as being a function of what of us being the bearers of negative rights. So what or positive rights as well. What do others owe me? What do we owe to each other? What does wrongdoing look like? What does injustice look like when a moral boundary's been crossed? And I, in connection with that, I do notice how often in the kinds of DEI advocacy conversations, there's a very keen sense of what injustices look like and where they are and how we can ferret them out. But comparatively, there's very little or sometimes almost no sense of a positive vision of what it would look like for all manner of things to be well, what it would look like
Mm-hmm.
for there to be a kind of moral peace and wholeness, a kind of shalom, we could say, uh, in our society. And maybe that is part of what the MacIntyre style reaction is getting at, where we want to point us back to um, that sense of acquired dignity as opposed to fundamental dignity. But coming to the question for you, Melissa, maybe there are other ways to bring together both the fundamental dignity and the acquired dignity. Do you think that maybe the idea that our dignity demands something of us, or the idea that our dignity is based on our capacities that call for a certain kind of fulfillment, do you think that these could be the places to emphasize with, other religious believers, but also maybe with secular DEI advocates? Do you think that could be a helpful starting point, or do you think we should take another route, maybe the language of a common good that we all belong to? Do you think that that would be the right angle to take, or where should we go?
I mean, I think the two angles that you mentioned are complementary, in fact,
Right.
and I think that they could be an interesting place to start. I mean, as I mentioned with that concept of actualized dignity, right? I mean, that's really the fulfillment of our more basic dignity, and that comes from using our freedom well, right? That calls from that comes from using our freedom to serve others, to promote the common good, to act with moral responsibility, right? And so I think if that side of the equation also needs to be emphasized without losing sight of the recognition that there is a baseline dignity and a baseline level of respect that is owed to everyone.
Great. Thank you, Melissa. Brandon, do you have any follow-ups or?
I think I think we've pretty much covered it.
Great.
Thank you
All
so
right.
much, Melissa. This was really interesting, and
Well, thank you. Yeah,
yeah,
it was a pleasure. Fun conversation. Lots of tricky topics,
Yeah.
great to be able to talk about them.
great.
Yeah. Thank you, Melissa.
Well, thank you,
Have,
Melissa.